Hello and welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. Some time ago, Alex O'Connor, a prominent atheist with multiple social media platforms such as the Cosmic Skeptic YouTube channel, the More Alex O'Connor YouTube channel, and the Within Reason podcast, uploaded a video called Every Argument for Atheism. Alex's video, Every Argument for Atheism, was a response Alex made to a video posted by popular Christian YouTuber Redeem Zoomer. My zeal for God and my love for the lost compels me to respond to some of the things Alex says in his video. Please like, comment, subscribe, and have a blessed rest of your day.
A new, fast-growing Christian YouTube channel, Redeemed Zoomer, put out a video promisingly called All Atheist Arguments Answered in 10 Minutes. Let's see how he does.
Faith is the opposite of logic and reason. No, it's not. Faith just means trust. Anytime you eat food, you're having faith that it's not poisoned, even if you can't scientifically prove it. If you're married, you have faith that your wife loves you, even if you can't scientifically prove that. And if you tried to scientifically prove it, she'd probably get very mad at you because it would mean you didn't trust her.
Yeah, but the thing is, I either have sufficient reason to trust something, or I don't. With food, for example, if I'm served a meal at a restaurant, sure, I'd trust that it's not going to poison me. But I know that my country has strict food laws, and that the restaurant has a huge interest in protecting my safety, and that poisonings are rare. But if I travel abroad to some places, for example, I won't trust the tap water. And with the wife example, I get what you're saying, but imagine if I gave my wife no evidence that I loved her, like nothing at all. And then when she said she was questioning the marriage, I just said, "You've got to have faith, baby." I think I'd be getting divorced.
Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we respond to Alex O'Connor with another installment from his video, Every Argument for Atheism. In this response, we provide an answer to the question that Alex intimated, which is there sufficient reason to believe that God exists? In the Redeemed Zoomer video to which Alex responded, the Redeemed Zoomer video has the atheist saying faith is the opposite of logic and reason. In the Redeemed Zoomer video, the Christian responds that faith just means trust. Anytime you eat food, you have faith that it won't poison you. If you're married, you have faith your spouse loves you. In Alex's response, Alex responds that you have to have sufficient reason to trust something. Either you have sufficient reason to trust something or you don't. With food, for example, if you're served food at a restaurant, it is reasonable to trust that the food you're served at a restaurant will not poison you because you know your country has strict laws to protect against that, and that restaurants have a good reason not to poison anyone, and that poisonings are rare. While those things that Alex said are true, I think those things that are taken for granted, not that we spend active time thinking about them while we're sitting at the restaurant. In some foreign countries, Alex won't trust the tap water. In the wife example, if Alex gave his wife no evidence that he loved her, it would be insufficient for Alex to just tell his wife to have faith in him because he'd failed to provide evidence to her that he loved her. And so with this, Alex appears to be implying that God has not provided sufficient evidence to show that he exists or that he loves those that he created in his image. So let me begin by saying that I wholeheartily agree with Alex that we should only believe things if we have sufficient reason to believe them. I 100% agree with Alex on that. The problem is that we will all disagree on what is sufficient reason. This is because what is sufficient can only be defined subjectively. I believe that many atheists have prevented themselves from finding the evidence for Christianity to be sufficient due to their improper definition of faith and their prior philosophical commitment. We're going to talk about their improper definition of faith shortly. I disagree with the atheist representation of the atheist position in the Redeemed Zoomer video, that faith is the opposite of logic and reason. That was the position illustrated in the Redeemed Zoomer video, that faith is the opposite of logic and reason. So allow me to unpack the problems that I see with the statement that faith is the opposite of logic and reason. Faith uses logic and reason to arrive at conclusions. Both atheists and theists exercise faith. When anyone, irrespective of worldview, is prescribed medication to take, they exercise faith using logic and reason to understand that the doctor was trained to diagnose the illness and to prescribe the medication. They exercise faith and use logic and reason to believe that the medication will have the desired effect. So they're using logic and reason to establish that the doctor was educated and that the pharmacist was educated and that the medication should have the desired effect, using their logic and reason to come to that conclusion. But they still have faith that the medication will have the desired effect. The point I hope to be making is to understand that faith is not the opposite of logic and reason, as the atheist contends. Rather, faith, logic, and reason each work together to lead people to conclusions for which sufficient reasons can be established for why those conclusions are reached. In other words, you're using logic and reason to have faith that if you take the medicine, that the medicine will help you. Theists and atheists, at least some atheists, agree that the universe and many of the things in it appear to be designed. Even Richard Dawkins himself has famously said that it has the appearance of design. Both theists and atheists use logic, reason, and faith to arrive at their conclusions. Atheists look at the evidence, and in doing so, they believe there's not sufficient reason to believe that God exists. Theists look at the same evidence, and they believe there is sufficient reason to believe that God exists. Many theists and atheists can agree that there are objective moral values and duties that make up a universal moral standard to which the entire human race is ultimately accountable. Theists ground that objective moral standard in God, while atheists do not. Both theists and atheists use logic, reason, and faith to arrive at their conclusions. Much more could be said to establish that there is sufficient reason to believe in God. At this point, I'd like to say that many atheists will make a caricature of faith and define faith as belief without evidence. You can search this up on the internet, and you can find that prominent atheists often define faith as belief without evidence, contrasting it with knowledge or critical thinking, which is just a sad caricature of the theistic worldview. Here are clips and sources where they deal with this perspective. Richard Dawkins, in a discussion at Oxford, explicitly defines faith as belief in something without evidence, arguing it can be dangerous because it can justify any action without the possibility of being corrected by evidence. He further elaborates in the Big Think interview that the only valid reason to believe anything about the real world is evidence assessed critically and logically. Sam Harris argues that the definition of faith is to believe something without evidence, while believing with evidence is knowledge. He frequently critiques religious moderation for protecting the uncritical respect to faith, calling for a shift toward rational evaluation. Christopher Hitchens often characterized faith as irrational and invested in ignorance. He famously posited that what can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence, in a statement known as Hitchens' razor, opposed to Occam's razor. Matt Dillahunty on the atheist experience frequently challenges scholars who use faith as a justification for belief, arguing that if they had evidence, they wouldn't need to appeal to faith at all. Faith is often described as belief without evidence, especially by critics of religion, but many religious traditions, particularly Christianity, define faith as trust based on evidence, testimony, or prior experience, acting as a commitment or action rather than a blind leap, though it involves conviction in things unseen. The term's meaning varies. It can mean blind trust, which is the atheist view, or a confident, evidence-informed trust, which is the Christian view. Perspectives on faith and evidence. The belief without evidence perspective. Critics argue faith is simply accepting propositions as true without proof, a way to bypass critical thinking or evidence, which is ludicrous because a Christian is actually commanded in Scripture to renew their minds, to be critical thinkers. Actually, contrary to the atheist claim about the Christian, whom they claim believes without evidence, the Scripture commands the Christian to actually know the evidence for the truth of the Christian faith when it says to always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. How can you give a defense unless you know how to defend it? Knowing how to defend it necessitates that we know the evidence for it. Richard Dawkins famously called faith belief in spite of, or perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. In this view, if evidence existed, faith wouldn't be needed as a reason for belief. Then there's faith with evidence trust perspective, which is the Christian biblical view. Hebrews 11:1 defines faith as the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, implying confidence, not cluelessness. In this view, faith is seen as trust in a relationship or testimony, a step onto a bridge that has held others, not a leap into the dark. Though on the atheist view, faith is a leap into the dark. On the theist view, it's not. Faith in the theist view involves knowledge, trust, and commitment, leading to action. Trusting a doctor's diagnosis leads you to take medicine. That was the point I made before, not even remembering that this said this when I made that point. In secular contexts, secular faith means trust or confidence, like having faith in a friend or your ability to pass an exam. In essence, the debate hinges on the definition. Is faith accepting something without evidence, like a leap of faith? That's what the atheist wants you to believe. Or is faith trusting in the light of the evidence and experience, even when not everything is fully seen? That's the theist position, otherwise called confident trust. So next, let's look at some definitions for faith from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So let's see. Does Merriam-Webster, a reputable dictionary, define faith as belief without evidence? It says allegiance to a duty or person. The Christian has allegiance or duty to Christ. Also, fidelity to one's promises. Well, the Christian has faith that God is going to be true to his promises. Sincerity of intention. Next, it says belief and trust in and loyalty to God. Well, a Christian has faith in God, and that faith is practiced as a belief in and trust in and loyalty to God. So belief can also refer to the cumulative doctrines of a religion. Sure, the Christian faith, you hear it referred to as that. It also says that faith can be a firm belief in something for which there is no proof. And of course, that would be what the atheist would want their audience to conclude about Christianity, that there is no proof. And of course, proof and evidence are two different things. I don't think that a theist can prove that God exists or that Christ rose from the dead, just like an atheist can't prove that God does not exist or that Christ did not rise from the dead. But as I said earlier, both the theist and the atheist have the same cumulative pile of evidence from which to make observations and arrive at conclusions. Also, faith, it can be complete trust, and that's what a theist has. They have faith in God, and also many atheists talk like they have that kind of faith in science, a complete trust in science, such that anything that science has not figured out, they will one day figure out. John Lennox calls it science of the gaps. In this definition of faith, where does it say what the atheists say what faith is? The atheists say that faith is belief without evidence. Please, show me. Where does it say that faith is belief without evidence? Belief without evidence. It doesn't, because that's not what faith is. So sure, when you give a false definition for faith, then you can set up a straw man like they do, and you can attack that straw man, and you can get people to agree with you, and then therefore they will say that there is no evidence for God and that faith is belief without evidence. But that's not the definition for faith. So whenever they say that faith is just belief without evidence, they're wrong. I hope they're not being intentionally deceitful, because that would be really terrible. Many atheists will make a caricature of faith and define faith as belief without evidence. They will lump each religion into the same pot without being willing to consider the merits of any religious claim. Those that do this, whether willingly or not, do so disingenuously. I am in no way accusing all atheists of being disingenuous. Let me say that again. I am in no way accusing all atheists of being disingenuous. I am calling atheists disingenuous when they are not even willing to consider the evidence that theists provide. The problem is that many are not willing to consider the evidence because they have a philosophical commitment to philosophical naturalism that forces them to leave absolutely no room whatsoever for anything supernatural. This pre-existing philosophical commitment requires them to reject supernatural claims without serious consideration of the evidence that theists bring. They mistakenly think that the only type of evidence that contains any truth value is empirical. This type of evidence can only be obtained from using the scientific method. They make this mistake due to their pre-existing philosophical commitment to philosophical naturalism. As I've shared before on this channel, as William Lane Craig brilliantly articulated so well to Peter Atkins, science, the employment of the scientific method, is woefully inadequate at obtaining knowledge in at least the following areas. Now we'll play this brief clip where Craig responded to Atkins about that.
That taken together with a reason why people believe, desperate to believe, together with the fact that you don't need actually a God, in a sense amounts to an argument against the existence of God.
Well, I guess I don't see that. I mean, why doesn't that commit the genetic fallacy of trying to say that by explaining how a belief originates, you thereby show the belief to be false? Even if it were true that belief in the existence of God were the product of fear and anxiety and so forth, which I don't for a minute admit, but even if it were, that's simply a genetic fallacy to say that because that's the way the belief originates, that therefore the belief is false.
But that's only one half of the argument. I'm not saying that that alone is adequate, and I'm not saying that the fact that science can account for everything, it alone is also adequate. But taken together, the fact that science is omnipotent, and the fact that I can understand why people like you desperately want to believe in God. That is an argument against the existence of God.
But two fallacious arguments put together don't make a sound argument, right?
They are, but do you deny that science cannot account for everything?
Yes, I do deny that science
So what can't it account for?
Well, had you brought that up in the debate, I had a number of examples that I was going to give. I think there are a good number of things that cannot be scientifically proven, but that we're all rational to accept. Let me list 5. Logical and mathematical truths cannot be proven by science. Science presupposes logic and math, so that to try to prove them by science would be arguing in a circle. Metaphysical truths, like there are other minds other than my own, or that the external world is real, or that the past was not created 5 minutes ago with an appearance of age, are rational beliefs that cannot be scientifically proven. Ethical beliefs about statements of value are not accessible by the scientific method. You can't show by science whether the Nazi scientists in the camps did anything evil as opposed to the scientists in Western democracies. Aesthetic judgments, number 4, cannot be accessed by the scientific method because the beautiful, like the good, cannot be scientifically proven. And finally, most remarkably, would be science itself. Science cannot be justified by the scientific method. Science is permeated with unprovable assumptions. For example, in the special theory of relativity, the whole theory hinges on the assumption that the speed of light is constant in a one-way direction between any 2 points A and B. But that strictly cannot be proven. We simply have to assume that in order to hold to the theory.
But you're missing the whole...
So put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Yeah, okay.
So none of these beliefs can be scientifically proven, and yet they are accepted by all of us, and we're rational.
So is there sufficient reason to believe in God? Well, quoting even the AI summary says belief in God varies widely among individuals and cultures, with arguments both for and against it. Philosophical arguments for theism include the cosmological argument, which suggests that everything that exists has a cause, leading to the conclusion that there must be an uncaused cause, often identified as God. The teleological argument points to the complexity and order of the universe as evidence of design, implying a designer. The moral argument argues that the existence of objective moral values and duties suggests a moral lawgiver. From scientific perspectives, some scientists and philosophers argue that the universe's origins and fine-tuning support the idea of a creator. Several chapters from Is Atheism Dead talk about fine-tuning. The cosmological, teleological, and moral arguments were discussed at length in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Others maintain that natural explanations such as evolution and cosmology suffice without invoking God, personal experience, and testimony. Many individuals cite personal experiences, feelings of transcendence, or transformative events as reasons for believing in God. Religious texts and traditions also provide a framework for belief, offering narratives and teachings that resonate with followers. Skeptical views. Critics argue that belief in God lacks empirical evidence, and that many phenomena can be explained through science. The problem of evil raises questions about the existence of an all-powerful, benevolent deity in light of suffering and injustice. Cultural and social influences. Belief in God is often shaped by cultural, familiar, and societal contexts, influencing individuals' perspectives on faith. The question of belief in God remains deeply personal and subjective, with diverse viewpoints reflecting a range of philosophical, scientific, and experiential considerations. So is there sufficient reason to believe that God exists? Well, even AI says it's personal and subjective. Is the term sufficient objective or subjective? So Alex's question, is there sufficient reason to believe that God exists? Well, can we agree upon whether or not something is objectively sufficient? I don't believe we can. And let me highlight this portion of the AI summary when I asked AI that question. Is sufficient objective or subjective? In everyday language, sufficient can be subjective, as it often depends on personal opinions or specific circumstances. For instance, what is sufficient for one person may not be sufficient for another based on individual needs or expectations. So you could make a case for the confirmation bias here. If you have a presupposition that God exists, some of the evidence that you find will be sufficient. If you have a presupposition that God does not exist, none of the evidence that you find will be sufficient. Therefore, sufficiency cannot be defined objectively. So that's why the intimation of Alex's question is it's never going to arrive at a universal answer, at least not a universal answer that will be satisfactory to everyone. Whether one considers the evidence for God's existence sufficient to warrant belief is subjective. Atheists like Alex think the evidence is insufficient to warrant belief. Theists like me think the evidence is sufficient to warrant belief. Some atheists have been persuaded by looking at the evidence and have turned into theists from being atheists. And it also goes the other way, too. Some theists have been persuaded by looking at the evidence and have turned into atheists. So, for some people, there is sufficient reason to believe that God exists, while for other people, there is not sufficient reason to believe that God exists. In conclusion, much more could be said to establish that there is sufficient reason to believe in the existence of a God, the nature of science itself, the distinction between the brain and the mind, the archaeological support for the Bible's historicity, the Old Testament's textual criticism, the New Testament's textual criticism, the historicity of Christ. All these work together to provide some examples for why there is sufficient reason to believe in a God. Christian apologists devote much ink and airtime to make their case. Since sufficiency is defined subjectively, however, not everyone will arrive at the same conclusion, though they must use the same available evidence. So I hope I've given the listeners here some additional things to think about. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and have a blessed rest of your day. I see the